If I can get everyone's attention, we're about to get started. And my name's Lou Murray. I live here in West Roxbury. And I want to welcome you all to West Roxbury, Boston's nicest neighborhood. God's country. So there's a gentleman here, Joe Abishano, one of my friends, and himself and myself and a few other people. We got an ad hoc committee together of Bostonians, and we put tonight's event together. And it's a discussion on I.C.E. and the work that they do in the city of Boston. There is a movement by the political hegemony of this city that wants to remove I.C.E. from our courthouse, where they go to arrest illegal aliens in a gun-free zone. And this is kind of taking sanctuary cities to a new level, sanctuary courts. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to have Mr. Todd Lyons, who is the new acting regional head of I.C.E. And if you give him a nice round of applause. As I said, Todd is the acting field office director. He previously was the assistant director of law enforcement activities for Oklahoma and North Texas. He, on his resume, he has been a detective of the Tampa Police Department. He's been a member of state law enforcement in Florida. He's a U.S. Air Force veteran. And most importantly, he is a son of South Boston. So give him a nice welcome.
Thank you.
And our interviewer tonight is Jessica Vaughan. She is the Director of Policy Studies for the Center for Immigration Studies. It's a Washington, D.C. based research institute that examines the impact of immigration on American society, educates policymakers, opinion leaders on immigration issues. She's been with the center since 1992. Her area of expertise is in immigration law is everything. And we're lucky to have her in this area, and she's recently completed several major projects, including a Department of Justice funded study on the use of immigration law enforcement in transnational gang suppression, which we know an awful lot about here in Boston with the presence of MS-13 and other gangs. She is an instructor for senior law enforcement, law enforcement officer training seminars at Northwestern University Center for Public Safety in Illinois. Prior to joining the center, Jessica was a foreign service officer with the U.S. State Department, where she served in Belgium and Trinidad and Tobago. Her articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the National Review, the Boston Globe, the Economist, San Francisco Chronicle. She's been frequently cited in the news, and she often appears on National Public Radio, CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Fox News. Yeah, Howie Carr. Howie Carr. And she has a master's degree from Georgetown University, and she earned her bachelor's degree in international studies at Washington College in Maryland. And before we get started, we have give her a big round of applause. You know, a lot of people said to me, like, oh, you're going to have another symposium on immigration, and, you know, don't you know that's the political third rail, and you're going to get all kinds of protesters and people that get upset. And the last time we did this 2 years ago, we had 70 protesters, and I think we have about 7 tonight. And a lot of them came inside, which I'm glad they did. You're more than welcome here. But I'd like to remind everyone that of a little historical anecdote. When Frederick Douglass was prevented from speaking in Boston by the mayor, who sent plainclothes police and a whole bunch of other hooligans to break up the speech in June of 1880. And 2 days later, Frederick Douglass was able to come and speak, and he said these words: "It will be no vindication of the right of speech to prove that certain gentlemen of great distinction eminent for their learning and ability, are allowed to freely express their opinion on all subjects, including the subject of slavery. Such a vindication would need itself to be vindicated. It would add insult to injury. Not even an old-fashioned abolition meeting could vindicate that right in Boston just now. There can be no right of speech where any man, however lifted up or however humble, however young or however old, is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. And that's what we're going to hear tonight, is honest sentiments from two of the leading policymakers on immigration in the Northeast and in the country. And so I hope that you'll just give them your attention. We're going to have a session of question and answers at the end. And if you don't agree with what they have to say, please respect their right to free speech and the listener's right to hear their free speech. And thank you all for being a great audience. And thanks for coming.
Puerto Rico, we see a lot that comes up from Dominican Republic. And with Boston having large shipping ports as well as fishing areas where boats can bring in large amount, we also have that element as well.
So who is doing, do the cartels have operatives here operating locally in New England or in different New England communities, or are they working with other gangs, or how does that?
You know, we've seen both, and actually National Geographic does a better job than I do, which is 2016, their series Drugs Inc. did a whole series on opioids in Boston. And if you go to minute 43 in their document for that series, they specifically say that the largest amount of heroin distribution is by people from Dominican Republic that are illegally present in the United States and based out of Lawrence, Massachusetts. So that isn't even from a government standpoint, that's from a TV series.
National Geographic.
So the presence is definitely real in Massachusetts.
And that's been corroborated by other reports that I've seen, whether it's hospitals looking, talking to people about where they obtain their drugs, or other law enforcement agencies saying that there definitely are hubs of activity here in the greater Boston area.
Right, and it was one of the main reasons that New Hampshire saw the spike in overdoses that they did, along with southern Maine, was the corridor on 495, which ran up through the southern part of New Hampshire in Maine, was just a large amount of fentanyl and heroin that was coming from the Lawrence-Lowell area.
Are these traffickers recruiting people to work for them here locally, or are they arriving with the specific purpose of trafficking here?
I would say it's a mixture of both.
All right. So ICE can play a role. I mean, it seems to me, and what I have found in research is that when a criminal is also in the country illegally, that makes them more vulnerable to law enforcement as a result. I mean, we have plenty of obviously crime is not a job Americans won't do, we all know that, but we're stuck with the American citizens who commit crimes.
Right. And that's one of the hard things for us, is that we have the opportunity to take an actual criminal element out of the community, out of the public. So when our hands are tied, when we don't have that cooperation, it's frustrating for us, because we don't understand why, if you have that chance to remove that piece of the criminal element out of the equation, you wouldn't let us have the opportunity to do our job.
Well, let's back up a little bit, because when the system is working the way it's supposed to, when the Secure Communities program is working the way Congress and the government agencies who are involved set it up, the idea was that a non-citizen is arrested, fingerprinted, identified, vetted through the Law Enforcement Support Center up in Williston, Vermont, where analysts review the cases and then send them back down to the field office,
right,
to you, where your officers make a decision about whether or not to pursue this case based on your resources and other things you know about the case. And then you would, and this happens very quickly, then let's say you have a case, someone who's been arrested for heroin trafficking, and you want to move on them. They're sitting in the Lawrence jail, or in, what is Lawrence, Middlesex County?
Essex County.
Essex County. And there they are. What happens next? How do you let local law, the way it's supposed to work, what would happen?
So historically, ICE would reach out to that law enforcement entity. We would coordinate with the police department, sheriff's department, state police to come question that individual to see if that was someone that ICE was interested in. We would then issue what's known as immigration detainer, which gives the local law enforcement the ability to detain someone for us up to 48 hours. In Massachusetts, before last year, that was the normal, everyday practice.
With most law enforcement agencies in the Commonwealth were
Yes, and nationwide.
complying.
Yeah. They would comply with holding that individual till we went and either picked them up or we made a determination if we were going to take them into custody or not.
So this is like someone who's wanted by another state or by another federal agency or something. The local jail would say, okay, yeah, we'll hold them for you.
Sure, and what it would be is, say someone gets arrested, and one of the most common ones we hear a lot as well, someone may just get arrested for driving with no license.
Which is a crime.
Correct, but a lot of local agencies don't see the larger criminal history someone may have. Us and the FBI have access to. So we might see.
So that's not going to show up on their.
A lot of times, a lot of state prosecutors only see the criminal history for their state. So someone could have committed a homicide in California and been a fugitive from ICE from there, or have done something, say in Florida, they were arrested for drug trafficking, served time, and then left, and have now taken on the identity of someone else. And they were arrested in Brighton. And when they were taken into Suffolk County, they were fingerprinted and their true identity was shown. While that person was only arrested for driving with no license, they had an underlying criminal history, which brought them to ICE's attention.
But the locals wouldn't necessarily know about that unless they're communicating with you.
Correct.
So what has changed? You said that that's the way it was
Sure.
over a year ago. What's changed here?
The Massachusetts Supreme Court had the Lund decision, which pretty much makes it null and void, if not illegal, for a state, local, police department, sheriff's department, house correction to hold someone for ICE within the Commonwealth.
So basically telling every law enforcement agency in the Commonwealth that they may not hold people.
They cannot hold someone for a civil immigration violation, which in effect hampers us because, like I said, as far as resources, if we can't get to a location quick enough by the time someone's, let's say, released on their own recognizance or they bond out, we may never see that individual again. And they also may not get the information that we have, that individual may not be the person who they think it is in their custody.
What was the rationale of the Supreme Judicial Court in that?
So one kind of...
and tell us a little bit about the case that...
Sure. So one kind of misnomer about ICE is people stay in immigration detention indefinitely. There was a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court called Zavidas, which if Immigration and Customs Enforcement can't remove someone after a certain period of time and their country won't take them back, after 90 days, if they can't produce a travel document, a case goes to our headquarters and then it's adjudicated from there. After that, we can't hold anyone in custody longer than 6 months. It's against the law for us to hold someone in permanent detention like that. In the Lund case, it was an individual from Cambodia who was an aggravated felon and filed a habeas with the state court that we will hold him in custody. The Massachusetts Supreme Court then came back that, that it was unlawful for a local agency to hold someone on a civil immigration detainer for any period of time.
Even though Congress has given ICE the authority to issue these detainers.
Right, and the detainers were a part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was enacted back in the 50s. So this has been on the books ever since 1950. So subsequently, local agencies can't hold individuals like this. And right after the Lund decision was enacted, this individual was released. We actually did have a travel document for him. He was scheduled for removal. He was released, and within a month's time frame, had went out and robbed and assaulted an elderly woman in a wheelchair in an ATM machine. So he's currently back in custody right now in Suffolk County. So we hope to take custody of him once he finishes his state time.
I mean, that's inevitably the result of these policies, is that if you can't take them, they're going to be released.
Oh, correct, yeah. I mean, immigration law falls under the Constitution as well. We can't hold someone unlawfully for an indefinite amount of time. So even someone that's foreign-born or non-immigrant, they're afforded their rights just like anyone else under the Constitution. It's just harder when we do have the opportunity, like I said earlier, to remove a criminal element from the public, and our hands get tied.
From what I've seen, looking at criminal justice statistics nationally, is that non-citizens who commit crimes reoffend at the same rates as American criminals do, which can be as much as half the time within a short period of time. So when these criminals are released, they have the opportunity, they're sent back to the community and have the opportunity to reoffend and create new victims. If they had been held in custody for you, as Congress has given the authority to happen and created a system for that to happen, they could have been sent home instead of back to the streets.
Right, and that's when we were talking about immigration detention earlier, is we would like to focus on those that are an actual true threat to the community. Part of that large amount of the non-detained population we have are those that have been arrested, but they do have strong ties to the communities, that do have pending benefits. They might be a lawful permanent resident green card holder, and they're going through their regular local court proceedings just like they would at the same time they're going through the immigration proceedings. So the misconception that we are holding up the justice system by removing someone so they don't have their day in court is also a false narrative, because these individuals that have been arrested by us, which we have released on some type of monitoring or in a non-detained setting, are still going through. They're getting their time in front of the court to either plead their case, and a lot of times they get dismissed, and a lot of times a lot of those cases do end up working out for the good of a foreign-born person, which they do eventually become a lawful permanent resident or a citizen. The problem is that decisions like Lund, certain policies which hinder cooperation with ICE, also runs the risk of having that extreme violent felon be released back.
Yeah, and we're starting to hear about these cases more and more often of people who've been released because locals won't cooperate. Now, local law enforcement agencies can't hold them for ICE, but what can they do?
When a local law enforcement agency does receive those fingerprint hits, they have the ability to reach out to us and notify us that they do have that individual in custody. Unfortunately, it's something we've seen nationwide. Here in the Commonwealth, we've seen a lot of agencies that have adopted a sanctuary policy where they won't actively cooperate with ICE. They won't hinder our law enforcement abilities, but they won't take any extra steps to notify us if someone's in custody.
So they're missing an opportunity to have somebody removed from the community instead of sent back to the street.
Instead of sent back, yeah.
Yeah. What other kinds of things in reading the papers, listening to the radio, you hear occasionally of some cases where individual judges, for example, are deciding that, they don't want ICE in their courthouses. Well, actually, I should back up a little bit. Why is ICE in courthouses more often now than before?
So ICE is in, we would rather arrest someone in a secure environment. When someone's identified in a jail, when they're in booking or they're in a house of corrections, that's a secure environment. We would much rather have our officers and agents go inside and interview those individuals and take custody of them in a secure environment.
Well, I know where I'd rather arrest a gang member.
It's safer for the officers.
In the jail.
And it's safer for the community as well. I would be a fool to sit up here and say that we don't have, the presence of ICE in a neighborhood doesn't have some type of chilling effect. The word that's like nails on chalkboard for me is a raid. ICE is doing a raid. We would much rather not have our officers out in a neighborhood that's, unsafe. We'd much have it in a controlled environment. This person has already been arrested for something, or they've already been arrested for something else. There is a reason that they came to the attention of ICE. We didn't go seek them out. They did something that's illegal or criminal outside of their immigration status. So a second part of the arrest. When they're released back on the street, now my officers have to go out and find that individual. It's just like a local police officer makes a traffic stop. The passenger in the car may be the target that they're looking for, but they might ID everyone else in the car, and someone may have a warrant for their arrest. Local law enforcement isn't going to leave that person behind. It's the same with us.
Surprise, surprise, criminals hang around together, so.
And there might be a wanted criminal with a van load of day laborers who are just trying to work. Well, now those poor individuals have now come on the radar of ICE. That's why ICE would much rather do targeted enforcement on individual people.
Who are sitting in a jail.
They're already in a jail, in a secure environment, and again, that they're there for, they did an action that put them in jail. So, like I said, ICE is a secondary step in the arrest process. When someone does appear in court, or they're transferred from from the jail to court for either first appearance or their bail hearing, they're still inside a secure environment. We would much rather arrest them there before they get a chance to go back out on the street.
How do you know when someone has a court date? Is that public information? Is that why?
Most of the time, we're notified either by the House of Corrections or local law enforcement, when the subject's next time going to be in court.
In the places that agree to cooperate?
Yes.
Because do all of them do that?
Not all. And a lot of it is just a lot of investigative work by the officers and agents to track down and look at court dockets and see exactly when someone's going to be in jail. Be in court that day.
Mm-hmm. So when ICE is going out into communities, they're more visible. It's obviously more dangerous for ICE agents, but also they become more, that can be intimidating to people who live in that community. But is it fair to say that the sanctuary policies are what is causing ICE to be doing the very kind of enforcement that proponents of sanctuary policies say that they don't like, which is the public?
Well, it's that public perception, and it's the public that we're forcing more and more people into the shadows. That crime is going to spike because people aren't going to come forward or testify or report crimes. Again, like I said earlier, this is my third administration. The previous, under President Obama, the 8 years I did immigration enforcement in Texas, in Oklahoma, we never saw it as bad as this. The worst part is when you politicize law enforcement, it makes it hard for everyone. So to hear that, ICE agents are the reason why crime's going to go up because they're in a community, or victims aren't safe because ICE there, it's fundamentally false. The other thing we hear a lot too, and you and I have discussed before in the past, that ICE is arresting people that are going to testify, that's a witness. ICE is arresting people at the courthouse that are getting their marriage license. I would love, I've said it before on every forum that I've done, both pro-ICE and anti-ICE. Just give me the example of the person we arrested that was a witness. Just one. I can tell you flat out, we do not arrest victims. We don't arrest witnesses. We are there specifically for the individual who committed a crime that put them in that courtroom.
Yeah, because I do hear sometimes, whether in debates or in talking to the news media or others, there are folks who support sanctuary policies who will say that, yes, of course, we think that criminals should be removed from the country, but ICE can get them other ways. It's too, if local law enforcement agencies are cooperating with ICE, if people think that if they go in to report a crime, that the police officers are going to call ICE, that they're not going to do it. This so-called chilling effect is a bigger problem that has to be avoided. And if ICE has to work harder to go find people, so be it. The problem with that I've found is looking at both the statistics from, say, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, from academic studies that have been done. Even I myself did an analysis of Boston's calls for service before and after Secure Communities was implemented. And I don't see that there's any such chilling effect. There's no evidence that immigrants or anyone else start refraining from reporting crimes because of greater cooperation with ICE. It just seems to be a complete myth.
Yeah, to me, it is a myth. And, again, haven't done the in-depth research like you have, but we have had victims of domestic violence through their attorneys or the victim advocacy program reach out to us and say, hey, we thought you guys deported this individual. We thought, he wasn't going to be released back. And now a lot of the times as we hear from some of the victim advocate groups that a lot of people victims of domestic violence don't want to report it because why are they going to report it when someone's just released and they thought ICE was going to hold them, and they go back and they victimize the person all over again?
So they're afraid of reporting not because of themselves having contact with ICE, but because the criminal is going to be released. So
the system has failed them. So where they thought that this, the victim would be safe because the criminal element was taken out, they just released right away before we had the opportunity to take action.
So they're afraid of the criminals who are released by the sanctuary policies,
right? And
not of ICE.
And the other part too is a lot of these same criminals victimize the non-U.S. citizen because they know that they'll go back to their community, and because of the bad information, the chilling effect like we talk about, that they can go ahead and they can continue to commit crimes because it's a more vulnerable population that these people don't want to come forward. So not only is it an impact on, communities like West Roxbury, Boston, but, communities like, Lawrence and Lowell that do have a large foreign-born population, when you have repeat offenders go back there because they know that the good, hardworking people of those areas aren't going to report crime because they're afraid of us, and it's just been a myth that's been put out there.
So proposals like the so-called Safe Communities Act and the Trust Act and so on actually work counter to these goals of building trust between local law enforcement agencies and ICE and the local community. They work against trust.
And actually, so prior to the current administration, under the Priority Enforcement Program, there was a list of specific crimes, specific reasons why, Immigration and Customs Enforcement took action on someone. And we didn't have a lot of the issues that we do now. It wasn't as politicized. It wasn't as much sanctuary policies. Again, coming from Dallas and speaking from my experience, Sheriff Lupe Valdez, which was the sheriff of Dallas County, she was the Democratic opponent for the current Texas governor now, ran against Greg Abbott. She was in law enforcement. She was a previously retired customs agent. And she was very progressive leaning, but even she saw the need to have her list of own crimes where she told her deputies and staff that, yes, these people need to be taken out of our community. And one of the biggest things she focused on was these were repeat offenders that were going back into the immigrant community. So for us, that was a positive, that where you had someone who was more of a progressive sanctuary style, but still saw the need to identify the criminal element that ICE could take action.
Yeah, I mean, if the issue is access to police services, if the concern is that you want immigrants to feel comfortable reporting crimes and to not be afraid to, I mean, there are many other ways to get that do not involve stifling immigration enforcement. You can have anonymous tip lines, you can have language designated officers, you can have community forums, you can have, Massachusetts is full of award-winning community policing programs. Need to shut off immigration enforcement to achieve that kind of relationship with the immigrant communities, it seems to me.
Right.
Have you noticed a public safety impact of the sanctuary policies that is,
We've seen it just in the fact that, just for example, the heroin and opioid epidemic. And that's one of the repeat thing we constantly hit upon, because that is really a challenge, a law enforcement challenge for the state right now. If you see any public debate, any talk at the State House or at the state and local level with police chiefs and law enforcement companions, they're all focusing on that. What can we do to curb the opioid crisis? We recently did a joint Department of Justice operation, which again focused on strictly up in Essex County. And we absolutely don't want to pick on the city of Lawrence all the time, but that's just a main hub for fentanyl and heroin. We as the group with Department of Justice, us, DEA, FBI, ATF, focused on, again, a strictly targeted operation on fentanyl and heroin traffickers. Because local law enforcement, like Lawrence Police Department, just don't have the resources to handle that. We arrested 58 criminals during that one-day operation. Out of that 58, 49 were foreign-born or previously deported. And they seized enough fentanyl to kill half the state of Massachusetts. You would think, operations like that would be evident enough to show that at least let us assist and help on those efforts. Do you think operations like that would show our worth to what we can do to public safety?
Yeah. Well, another area of law enforcement and public safety that has, I've noticed, become somewhat more politicized lately has been gang disruption and anti-gang efforts. And sometimes there is a nexus with immigration enforcement as well, particularly when you're talking about those particular gangs that have a lot of non-citizens who are members, like MS-13, 18th Street, and so on. And there was a time about 10 years ago when ICE was working very closely, even with some of the jurisdictions that are now considered sanctuaries, to address this problem. Now, and they made a big dent in MS-13 activity and other gangs here in the areas, particularly around Boston. But we've seen a resurgence of some of these gangs lately, in part because of the influx of unaccompanied minors from Central America. For example, I've seen other ICE agents say that something like 30 to 40% of the MS-13 members who've been arrested by ICE originally arrived in the country as unaccompanied minors.
Right, and that was actually at the influx of the unaccompanied minors in 2013, 2014. So what we saw was a large amount of, unaccompanied young kids, 10, 12, 13, who came in, and they were literally had a address pinned to them and ran to the first Border Patrol agent they saw. It was like return to sender. And it had a family member in the United States. It was just such a large influx at the southern border that we couldn't get any, couldn't reach family members, at the whatever, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, wherever they were from, to come, pick up these children, that they were released to family members or individuals in the U.S. who would take them in. But what we see, though, is like anything, you have young kids that come in to areas that already have a criminal element that's already rooted, and now they're joining the gangs to fit in with the kids who have been here before, or just a criminal element that's here before. So now we've seen an uptick in kids that have come in the first wave of the unaccompanied minors back, like I said, 2012 to 14, which are now high school age, that are, committing crimes. And again, we still see more of an influx now that are coming in that are just a new wave that's going to get ready to be integrated.
Yeah, it hasn't stopped. It hasn't slowed down much. What do you think that can be done to address that problem in particular?
For us, when we can work with local law enforcement to root out the main issue that's leading kids to gang violence, or that criminal element that's recruiting. A lot of the times in a lot of the gangs you'll see, especially in MS-13, is you'll have older individuals who have been established here in the United States that are, going after those vulnerable, kids that are here on their own, that are in the immigrant community, that are recruiting them and bringing them into that lifestyle when they think that there's no other choice that they have. The problem is that when you have the repeat gang members, the serious violent ones that have already been identified by local law enforcement, which aren't turned over to ICE, which ICE isn't afforded the opportunity to remove them from the element. That it keeps that individual there to just keep recruiting and building more and more, which is going to lead to more kids who did come for a better life turning to gang violence.
The ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the Boston Police Department to obtain access and make public the database of gang members that is maintained. What effect would that have on your ability to cooperate with Boston Police Department or to address the problem?
Sure. I mean, I can't speak specifically to like any type of ongoing litigation. So just in generality, any time that information is stifled to us, it hurts our ability to do our mission. Again, law enforcement, whether it's Boston Police, DEA, FBI, us, it shouldn't be politicized. It's the letter of the law. There should be nothing misconstrued about law enforcement officers doing their job, operating under the guidance of, written law that's been on the books for an extremely long time, that are all working in a common effort just to protect citizens. Anytime that information is stifled, or the use of it may be interpreted one way which isn't favorable, that has extreme impact on public safety.
Well, I just have one more question that I'd like to ask you before we turn to the audience, because I know there'll be some questions from the audience, and that is, I know it's not all sanctuaries around the Commonwealth, that there are some law enforcement agencies here that are working particularly with ICE. I wonder if you could just take a minute to explain the 287G program that has been, that a number of sheriffs in the state have been enrolled in. In fact, Mass Department of Corrections has had for more than 10 years, I think.
The Massachusetts Department of Corrections is one of the longest standing 287G partnerships within our agency.
Started under Governor Romney, I think.
Right. And it's been a great partnership. It identifies criminal aliens that are getting ready to be released after long-term prison sentence in the state of Massachusetts. It also helps to identify inmates that have adopted U.S. citizen identities that have been living under false identities for the longest time. So the 287G partnership, 287G is a part of the Immigration Nationality Act, which deputizes local law enforcement to act as designated immigration officers. There used to be two models. There was a task force model, which focused on a lot of state police departments, which did a lot of highway interdiction, and the jail model, which primarily focuses on people that have been arrested, like the ones we were talking about earlier. The task force model went away. It was one of the ones that a couple of years ago we saw that did have the most chilling effect as far as, the guys out there doing traffic enforcement were now doing immigration work.
Although here, Massachusetts had a task force also,
Yep.
the staties. I think they were using it for fugitives and
Fugitive smuggling.
drugs and
A lot of human trafficking.
human trafficking.
So the jail model focuses on identifying those inmates at the classification level in the first booking that are foreign-born. One of our newest partnerships is in Barnstable County. I just recently spoke at their 287G Steering Committee Public Forum, where the sheriff and myself, pretty much it's just an open forum for the community to come and ask about the program, any concerns they have. One of the things I was proud about is, so the partnership is only 8 months old, 9 months old. We started June. During that time frame, they identified 56 individuals that were foreign-born that were booked into the Barnstable County Jail on some type of crime. Out of those 56 that were identified, only 12 were identified to ICE for immigration enforcement. Those 12 crimes were 3 for homicide, 4 for rape, and the other ones were all crimes of violence. Out of those 12, 10 are still in custody in Barnstable County serving their time. 2 have been gone through the immigration proceedings. 1 was formerly deported, and the other one left on a voluntary return to their country. Mm-hmm. So it was good to show the people in the Cape that, again, someone that's arrested for driving without a license, while you may come to ICE's attention, and you may receive a letter in the mail from us later on that we need to talk to you about your immigration proceedings, you're not going to be locked up at that time. This shows that...
It's not like a trap door.
No, and it shows that
deportation.
all the cases were extremely vetted. So, and the egregiousness of the crime was one thing that I really was happy to highlight, because, again, the misnomer is that we're arresting these people, are just, the 287G officers that are deputized down there are just, looking at every individual that comes in, putting people in immigration proceedings, a mass deportation machine, where it's not. 287G is a force multiplier for us. We don't have the resources in the Cape. Cape and the Islands is someplace that's very hard for us to reach.
Yeah.
And to have the ability to identify people that were murders. They identified a wanted Brazilian national that was wanted for murder back in Brazil. Several out of the 12 all had fake Puerto Rican identities that they stole from U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico that were identified through the program. So it's definitely a good partnership, which again identifies the criminal element in a secure environment where ICE officers aren't in the street, aren't in the community, and they're focusing on the worst of the worst.
But that's a big deal for Barnstable County, because several years ago, I remember Sheriff Cummings, the sheriff of Barnstable County, was very frustrated because he had a number of non-citizens that had been identified in county jail that had committed fairly serious crimes that he could not get ICE's attention on to come down and take into custody. And so now with 287G, he has the ability, his officers can start the
Right.
First of all, identify them because they have access to the database that ICE uses, and also launch the proceedings under your supervision, right?
Right, yeah, and the whole 287G program is supervised by ICE deportation officers and supervisors that are on site to screen all the cases as well that those deputies identify.
So those 12 kids, you said 12 out of 56
12 out of 56.
were processed for deportation.
They were processed for deportation. The 2 that were released on bond and later arrested by ICE. Even though Sheriff Cummings does have the program, he still is held to the letter of the law when the Lund decision. So ICE wasn't available to take custody of those individuals. So once they were convicted of their crimes, ICE did arrest them, and then they were placed into deportation proceedings. And then the other ones are still either held no bond or high bond going through their regular criminal cases within Barnstable County.
But these are cases that would never probably have been processed before.
Before, no.
So that's good. So we should cover before we take some questions from the audience?
No, I think it's just, I thank Lou and I thank you for taking the time for at least, letting me explain what we do. The men and women of ICE they're really true law enforcement professionals, and I think a lot of it gets lost nowadays in the fast-paced news cycle. One thing I like to stress is there's a lot of, misnomers like we talked about in myths. I can only speak to ICE Boston. I can tell you that ICE Boston is not housing any families. We don't have any children in custody. And I speak to the protesters at my office a lot.
Well, there would never be a child in ICE detention.
No, it's
Anyway.
the Office of Refugee Resettlement handles all that through a lot of charity work. Catholic Charities is an excellent partner that assists with that, and just you see a lot of the issues on the border bleed over to the north. And the positive work we do and the positive impact we have in the community kind of gets lost in that. So I would much rather someone hear it from me, directly from me, whether it be in a pro-immigration setting or in any immigration setting. I'd rather explain our position. If we have a different view, so be it. That's why we live in the United States. Right? But I would much rather speak up for the folks that work for me because they do great work every day. And it kind of gets lost in the mix.
Well, thank you very much for all you do and for all the men and women of ICE do for us. And I'd love to take some questions. We have cards, is that? I think the way we're going to do this is those of you who have questions can fill out a card, and Lou Murray is going to collect them. And I'm going to sit and try and think of something to say until we get the card.
You can tell me if I'm telling the right thing or not.
But what is the typical concern that people have when you go to a public forum?
A lot of the concerns we hear a lot is on the family units, that we're separating families, that we're, but the problem is that, like any law enforcement agency, Boston Police may arrest someone tomorrow. Well, he's arresting that person he's separating that person from their family. What's lost in it is that, the law enforcement aspect of what we do is lost on that. And that's kind of frustrating.
Well, here's a very timely question. We hear a lot about human trafficking these days. Can you explain more precisely what this is? Are these modern-day slaves, and what jobs do they do?
Yeah, I mean...
And I think there was a comment I read, I think on Twitter or somewhere today, where someone said, human trafficking, that's a distinction without a difference. Human trafficking is,
right.
There's a definition.
So we definitely have two different types, right? You have the human trafficking that you see a lot at the border, where people are paid to be smuggled in,
they choose to be, you mean between smuggling and trafficking?
Right.
There's a difference,
So you have, sometimes a lot of that gets kind of, misconstrued and people sometimes blend the two together. So when you have someone that's actually paying to be smuggled in the United States, whether that be through the border or over waterways, that's one of the main ways we see smuggling. Human trafficking is where someone's brought in under the guise that they're being brought over here for one type of job, let's say, or they're being brought here to a promise of a better life, or to go to school. And when they get here, their passports taken from them, their visas taken from them. A lot of these organizations sponsor these individuals, go through all the proper steps to get these individuals either a B1, B2 visa as a just a visitor. And then once they arrive in the United States, all their documents are taken from them, and they're pretty much enslaved. Now you're at the will of these people. We see a lot of that in, a lot of the service industries where people, come over to work. A lot of the lower skilled labor, we see that in. And unfortunately, there is the sex trafficking side of that as well. That's a major thing in the news right now, where people from another country are, like I said, brought in under the guise that they're coming here to do a job, go to school, but yet now they're enslaved to go ahead, and now they're brought into a sexual ring, which takes on a whole nother element of its own.
And most of the anti-trafficking work is done by your counterpart agency, HSI.
Homeland Security Investigations. They take the lead on all of our smuggling and human trafficking, as well as our child pornography and exploitation is there.
And they work very closely with victim protection and advocacy organizations here in the state.
They do. They're a great group of people that deal with, these victims that are in really, really dire need, and they really help them get U visas, S visas, which allow them to stay in the United States after this. Yeah,
that's another important point that, when we were talking about people being afraid to come forward to report crimes. There are special visas in place specifically for victims of crimes, victims of trafficking, people who are witnesses and informants.
Exactly.
And for that, you need the cooperation of local law enforcement agencies so that people have access to them.
Right. We need to know from the local law enforcement, the potential victims and witnesses that they have, so we can work with them to get those individuals the rights and protections to stay in the United States to help in these criminal cases.
Someone has asked, how can one find out who the ICE directors are in other counties and cities in Massachusetts? Well, you're the only one in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'm the only one for New England.
But aren't the field office directors identified on ICE's website?
On ice.gov, it's on the menu side. It has a list for Homeland Security investigations as well as enforcement removal operations, and under those tabs, it gives you a breakdown of our 24 field offices, what areas they cover, and who the director is for those regions.
A couple people have asked how your role, and another person put it a different way, how things changed since January 2017.
So, and I've said this a lot, and we in Massachusetts, our elected officials are really good about reaching out to us direct and in speaking to us about challenges. And yesterday, Congressman Seth Moulton came to our office to kind of talk one-on-one, tour the operation, and kind of see firsthand. And he asked, what is one of the things that really hinder us? And the hardest thing to do is to do immigration enforcement by executive orders. Each president has their own, an administration has their own take on immigration enforcement. Since 2017, under President Trump, we've had one set of executive orders. Under President Obama, we had 8 years of a different set of executive orders. Under President Bush, we had another set of executive orders. The constant change and the constant flux is something that's, it really hurts our operations and kind of almost morale for ICE officers, in that we don't know day to day or by administration change how we're going to do our job. One of the biggest things is, and General Kelly, first Homeland Security Secretary under President Trump, said it best, is we didn't need 6 pages of an executive order. It could have been 1 sentence. And it says, enforce immigration law as it's written. It's been written since 1954, and it hasn't been changed. So what I told Congressman Moulton was, he said, you guys have the ability. ICE officers are the first people that will say, we need immigration reform. Change it so we know how we're doing our job each day.
Here's a good question. Should those politicians who advocate the elimination of ICE succeed, who would do the work that you do to protect our communities? For example, does DEA have legal authority to arrest and detain foreign nationals?
By U.S. Code and by the Immigration Nationality Act, only designated immigration officers have that ability to do that. The FBI does have some limited immigration enforcement, but we are the only ones bound by law that can take immigration action on someone. When I say us, it's under the umbrella of DHS. So Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, and us, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, are the only ones that can do it. So if we were to go away, there wouldn't be anyone in place to do that.
And that's exactly why cooperation with ICE is so important. If you have a problem with human trafficking or with transnational gangs or with drug trafficking done by foreign nationals, you really have to be cooperating with ICE if you want to make inroads on that problem.
And one thing too is there is also a foreign element that comes to the United States escaping their crimes they committed in their host country. Interpol works closely with us almost daily, where we receive Interpol warrants for individuals that are here in the United States. The last operation we did locally netted 7 individuals that were wanted by Interpol, 2 wanted from Brazil for murder that have been hiding here in the United States. We arrested a wanted Jamaican that was on America's Most Wanted that killed several individuals in Jamaica and then came to the United States and killed his pregnant girlfriend in Florida and had been hiding out under an assumed identity. So to not have ICE, whether it be ERO, Homeland Security Investigations, Border Patrol, to not have that immigration tool in your law enforcement toolbox is just, you need to have that piece of law enforcement.
There have been some cases in the news of judges releasing non-citizens who've been arrested, found guilty even of crimes, but still receiving what appears to be a lighter sentence in order to avoid deportation. And here's one question here. How can judges maintain a double standard of implementation of laws and consequences? Do you see this happening sometimes? And can you give, and if so, can you give an example of that dynamic?
Sure, and I can, a lot of times, which is frustrating for a lot of folks in the media, is, believe it or not, immigration enforcement is one of the most strictest regulated when it comes to privacy. So a lot of times we can't speak about people's immigration cases, even when it has a criminal nexus. But one case that I can't speak of specifically, because it has been in the media a lot, is up in Salem with Judge Feely, who had a heroin trafficker in front of him, and on open record said, had you been a U.S. citizen, I would have gave you a stiffer sentence. But because he saw drug dealing as a way for this individual who was foreign-born to make money, it was a financial crime, and he had to give a lesser sentence. Now, we went and arrested the guy as soon as he got released from court, because that's just mind-boggling. I mean, again, like, one thing that I'm proud of, even though we do have that, stigma in the media that we're these horrible people that are sending people back to their countries and deporting people, people still have rights under the Constitution. We honor their rights, just like a U.S. citizen. And so for any judge to see someone differently just so they're not deported, it definitely puts a mark on the letter of the law.
Right. And there are many reasons to enforce immigration laws that go beyond public safety. such as maintaining the integrity of our legal immigration system, when we have 4 million people in the world who've been sponsored successfully by a family member or an employer for a green card and who are waiting their turn to come here.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's one thing we hear a lot of, especially, if you just take New England and Boston in general, it is the melting pot when it comes to immigrant communities. Everyone here, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, have come from some other country for a better life. What we see a lot of is that you have a lot of people here that have come here, done it the right way, the legal way, and now the next time that their relative that they're trying to petition for is their number will be drawn, you're looking 10, 30 years out, where someone can come here illegally or administratively overstay their visa and skip ahead of the line where someone has already, tried to do it the right way. I think it definitely for that part of the immigrant community, it's extremely frustrating.
Would the proposed sanctuary legislation, and I think they're referring to the Perennial Safe Communities Act, affect the 287G program in Barnstable County or any of the other counties?
Yes, so it'll make any partnership with I.C.E. null and void. The 287G program would be null and void. Any intergovernmental service agreement that we have with any entity would be null and void.
For holding people, reimbursing counties.
County and the state for housing immigration detainees, that'd be null and void. It would be
that's a lot of money we're talking about with those IGSAs, right? With some of these counties?
Yeah, we because immigration detention standards are a lot higher than regular detention standards for most House of Corrections.
Say that again.
So we hold facilities to a higher standard than they hold themselves. A lot of agencies and Sheriff's Department won't enter into agreement with us because our level of care is a lot higher than a U.S. citizen is. Our detainees have a stricter diet. Well, granted, it's still prison food, but as far as their calorie content, their housing is totally different than other cell blocks. Our detainees have more rec time, they have more library time, they have more legal time with attorneys, and there's more avenues to them for a lot of more charity organizations like Catholic Charities to work with them. So we actually have to pay a higher fee to these facilities because sometimes they even have to structurally change things where where their current bedding might not meet our needs. So it's expensive to take an immigration detainee over a regular county detainee.
But ICE reimburses these counties.
Yeah, we pay a pretty good penny. We could pay anywhere from $83 a day in some parts up to $179 a day per diem to house an immigration detainee.
So if these agreements were to be null and void because of this, if the legislature were to pass the Safe Communities Act, for example, as it was drafted,
right? So
these counties would lose that reimbursement.
They would lose reimbursement, and we would also lose our ability to detain someone in Massachusetts or New England. Mm-hmm. But not only that, it would. Whereas now, even though the Lund decision limits local agencies from holding us, it doesn't hamper an agency from reaching out to us. Mm-hmm. If this goes forward, law enforcement agents there won't be that line of communication. It would stifle any type of limited partnership we have right now.
But I could go through the whole stack of questions. I don't know if Todd could sit there. But so tell me, okay, would expansion of the southern border wall significantly help ICE? And I would add, and if so, how? If not, why not? So
again, ICE is totally separate from the Border Patrol. The wall in certain in strategic locations where there's a high trafficking area of illegal entry happening would absolutely help the Border Patrol. Where it would help ICE is it would free up our officers to focus on the criminal element that's here. We wouldn't have, a lot of my resources now are dedicated to case management of a lot of recent border crosses from the southwest border, where we're supporting the overflow of detainees from the border, which takes away our bed space because we have to hold detainees from the south. And
For people who've been apprehended crossing illegally in Texas or California or Arizona,
Right.
they don't have space, ICE transports them here.
To where we do have space, which in turn we have to, if another ICE officer outside the border, we have to prioritize the people we have in custody and see what type of, how we could free up bed space to make room for the overflow. So any type of way to help CBP at Customs and Border Protection at like points of entry, or the Border Patrol, help them with enforcement, it would definitely help the interior, because then we can focus our efforts on the criminal element that are already rooted in here.
Right. So to the more apprehensions that are happening at the southwest border, that impacts your detention space, and that means that you may have to make decisions that would lead to someone's release as opposed to being held in detention because those beds are taken up by border cases.
Correct. And ICE, when they talk about ICE at the border, we aren't making those arrests. Like I said earlier, we're by charter, we're responsible for the detention and well-being and care of those individuals. So when Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection arrests someone, that falls on us. And we don't have the infrastructure for the large amount of cases we see at the border, which need to be adjudicated quickly. So a lot of offices like Boston, New York, Philadelphia have to send our officers down to the south to have to move cases quicker through the system, which then in turn takes people off the street for us, or takes people away from identifying a criminal threat here to help assist on the southern border.
Because your agency's funds are limited.
Right.
Yeah. It's a good question. Going back to the Lund decision, does the SJC decision include, I would say, apply to individuals who have committed serious crimes?
Yes.
So it's across the board?
Across the board, no matter what someone's crime is. Someone could be a prime example. Since I've been here, we've had 3 Uber drivers arrested for sexual assault or rape. To me, those are significant, egregious felonies. All 3 of those individuals weren't held by the local agency or the court, and they were released.
Not a single one, someone accused of rape?
Of rape, was able to bond out. ICE wasn't notified. That individual bonded out. Out of those 3, 1 was taken into custody. The other 2 have already fled the United States.
One of them was the case out of Weymouth, right?
Right, that individual's from Ghana, and he left and flew out of Logan the next day. And then the other subject was from the Dominican Republic. And even though we had a warrant because he was a previously deported felon that already came back, he was able to be released from custody, even though we had a warrant, and he fled back to the Dominican Republic.
Any other examples you can think of?
There's every day, I hate to say it, what really lately has irritated me is to see elected officials go on the media and say that certain crimes are no longer egregious because they're committed by foreign-born nationals, one being DUI. Under the last administration, DUI was a high priority, and I think you're very familiar with it in Fairfax. The 2 Benedictine nuns that were killed by an illegal alien was one of the big igniters to the priority enforcement program that brought OUI and DUI to the forefront of these repeat DUI offenders. So for elected officials to say that now it's racist to hold a foreign-born national to the same standards of a United States citizen on an arrest like DUI and it's not a criminal act, that's, I would say would go against the oath they took as an elected official. There's a case today in the media. Individual crashed his car into a tree in Lynn. Had a 7-year-old daughter in the car. When they took, when EMS came to take him out of the car, Luckily, he and his daughter were fine, but he had 18 beer cans in the car. When EMS took his 7-year-old daughter out of the car, he had stuffed empty beer cans in her sweatshirt, thinking they were not going to find it. But yet he was released on bond. He was identified through fingerprints and ICE. However, we didn't receive a phone call on him, which my officers then went out and we rearrested that individual. So the Lund decision, it affects OUI all the way to homicide.
And I think it's important to emphasize that, of course, Americans commit crimes too, but when someone is committing a crime and is here illegally, especially if they've been deported before, it's appropriate for ICE to remove them. I mean,
And, a lot of the cases too, you see that they're released, they go to their first appearance in court, they're scheduled for the next court date, they're still a fugitive. Now they're a fugitive from the local jurisdiction and they're a fugitive from us. So the grand notion that someone that's adopted a foreign, ID, taking on the identity of a U.S. citizen, it's pretty ignorant to think this person's going to come back and appear for their court date.
Yeah, that is a fact that is often lost in this debate, that almost by definition, people who are here illegally, especially if they've adopted a false identity, are a flight risk.
Right, and again, that's not to sit here and say that every foreign-born person that goes in front of a judge has done that. That'd be ignorant on my part to say that. But I can give you case upon case upon case where I show the need for why we should be a part of that joint immigration law enforcement tool, and that nexus there, so someone else isn't victimized, because I pretty much guarantee that person who was arrested for fentanyl trafficking, who didn't appear the next day and had a Puerto Rican identity, probably has another Massachusetts driver's license under another name right now. And we won't know again where that individual is till he's arrested and fingerprinted again.
How widespread is the problem of identity theft?
Although it's not, you would say it's egregious or a violent felony, it's rampant. It's so widespread that the use of people's social security numbers, people's personal identity, as far as names, date of births, it's rampant all through the law enforcement system, and especially by, the foreign criminal element that adopt these identities.
And that is not a victimless crime either.
No, most of the time there is a U.S. citizen who's attached to that social security number. And sometimes when we put a social security number in the system, not only will we see that poor, 78-year-old man in Encino, California, who's really the U.S. citizen, we might see 10 or 12 different other foreign nationals that have, bought that identity or recycling that same social security number, where not only have they taken that person's identity, but that one social security number may have had 3, 4, 7 tax refunds run through on the same time.
Yeah, and sometimes it's kids too, the numbers, because of the protocol for assigning social security numbers, you can tell which ones haven't been issued, so some of the document rings will give out, or sell, to be more accurate,
right,
numbers that they have not been issued, and then a few years later,
when they apply for a student loan,
or
they realize someone has been using their identity, or they get pulled over because someone has now adopted their given name.
Or there were some cases in Utah where an American citizen mother took her daughter to apply for Head Start and was told that her daughter didn't qualify because she had $30,000 a year income working at McDonald's in California. So there are real victims of identity fraud and identity theft. How are you familiar, or I'm sure you're familiar with it, but do you hear much about the IMAGE program here in Massachusetts?
So our counterparts do that?
Yeah.
And there is, especially with the technology and the industry boom and that comes to New England, specifically, Massachusetts, because of the great schools. There are a lot of businesses that have taken part in the image program.
This is a program ICE runs, and again, it's HSI, the counterpart agency to ERO, that helps businesses do their due diligence to make sure that they do not hire illegal workers by using E-Verify and the Social Security number verification system and a few other techniques. How important do you think programs like that are to addressing illegal immigration?
I think it's extremely important. Not only does it help to root out those, identity thefts that we talked about, but it also helps to handle and correctly funnel the legal immigration system we have as well. It definitely affords those opportunities where you have those individuals that have a certain skill, a certain education, who want to stay in, be a productive, citizen of the United States, lawful resident, but at the same time, it weeds out the ones who are hiding in plain sight using someone else's identity.
All right. Well, again, I thank you for taking the time to be here to explain what you do.
I appreciate you letting me ramble. So.
No. Very informative. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Jessica, and I want to thank Todd. This was a great night. It's a platform that many people are not afforded across the country. I got calls from Washington, D.C., California, Colorado, reporters that wanted to be here tonight. So anybody that's got their videotape, it's very valuable.
Oh, and I should add, we are recording the event, and it will be published on the Center for Immigration Studies website as well. So.
Great. That's great. And we couldn't have had the event without the audience that came out on a very cold night in Boston. So give yourselves a round of applause. And then we're going to call it a night and let everybody get home safe. And thanks again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.